That is the Gold Coast and the point from which these early shipments came. Now we look at the indirect slaves. You know, I remember having this discussion with Dr. Saunders years ago, but I honestly thought because they were indirect, and you can see the various points at which they come from in the Americas, but I really thought because they were indirect, they would be Creole slaves, they would not be African. But guess what? 81% of the indirect imports are actually African. So, shipping records for that period show that, let me get to my summary slide, all right, that we can see that of all of these slaves, 81% of indirect imports are African-born, that more than half of them, of the total slave count in this comp period, are actually African-born, so that there is like considerable evidence that although we're not plantation, we are maritime, there's considerable evidence that we are actually getting slaves directly from Africa. Shipping records for that period, like if we want to see South Carolina and Jamaica as being two of the places from which these slaves are imported, therefore we can go to the South Carolina imports and show that they are actually Senegambian. Well, Carolina had a very long and involved slave trade, which changed as it went from rice cultivation to indigo cultivation to cotton cultivation. So, and those from Jamaica were from the Gold Coast, so that those people would have reinforced the early shipments that we just looked at. How did I get to the Loyalist period? No. I want to, before I close out on the Loyalist period, I want to look at the growth population to point out that if you look at the growth population, now the thing that we're going to do, looking at the growth population, is to look at the white to black demographic, because this is very important in determining, you know, what kind of language system was emerging based on whether there was a fusion between Creoles and English colonists, or whether there were more English colonists than African or people of African ancestry. So you can see some trending going on there, so that you look very early in the period and you see where, well, first off, the whole slide shows that the growth of the population is extremely slow. But the dynamics between the white and black demographics shift. In the early part, you have majority white people in all three settlements. You go to 1783, and the demographic changes in New Providence. Yes, so that 70% of the population, let me try and pull this around a bit. So that 70% of the population is African. You go to Hobart Island and Eleuthera in this period, and you see that it is almost the reverse of what is happening in New Providence, that 71% of Hobart Island population are white and 30% are African ancestry. And in Eleuthera, it's just a little bit lower. So, if we consider linguistic acculturalization, we can see that from these three locations in early period that the acculturization process cannot be the same for all the islands, you know, nor was it necessarily the same for all slaves on any one island. Quite clearly, in the early history, we have the ingredients for creolization, but not necessarily the conditions for creolization in all settlements. As I've suggested in a previous paper, the ratio of white to black on Eleuthera, and especially Hobart Island, suggests that African or Creole speakers on the islands would have acquired the dialect of English spoken by the old inhabitants. I mean, would have acquired the dialect of English, but there would be some influence from their mother tongues. In the town of Nassau, the mariners and domestics who lived and worked closely with their English owners would over time acquire a dialect of English, again, with some influence from their mother tongues, depending on their age. I mean, age is a very important factor in acquisition. And those who lived and worked on subsistence farms or small plantations, more scattered outside of the ship in New Providence, would have spoken an English Creole, heavily influenced by Twi and Fante, spoken on the Gold Coast. This is, for me, I think, a very important consideration because it is at this time that we see the birth of Bahamian Creole English, which I will be referring to BCE as I go through the paper. Even though its growth and influence would be constrained by the small numbers of speakers, etc., their relative isolation from the majority of the slaves in the township would mean fusion, all right? Would mean that they would emerge, that their language would be some form of Bahamian Creole English. There is a sociologist, Margaret Creel, who observes that those who arrived earlier may have as strong an impact as latecomers of a more numerical strength. So it is important to recognize the birth of BCE in the outlying farms and plantations of New Providence in the early settlement, which very much might have flourished with the new social structure introduced by the Loyalists, and would have been a considerable influence in the prevailing spoken Creole that emerged on New Providence after the arrival of the Loyalists. More specifically, the Twi and Fante languages spoken by the Gold Coast slaves possibly served as a foundation for the evolving Bahamian linguistic patterns introduced by the Loyalists. I really like this quote by Whittington Johnson because, you know, I think that tending the land was the Achilles heel of the Loyalists. Roaming the seas was the strength of the Conks. Because I think that in a lot of interpretations, I'm not talking about the general histories, but I'm talking about people who try to look at language through the lens of the social conditions of the historical period. Many people tend to start with Bahamian Creole when the Loyalists arrive. But, I mean, it is clear that, you know, the maritime pursuits of the Conks just didn't disappear when the Loyalists arrived, you know. So that, I mean, what we've got to look at as we start looking at the Loyalists is, again, where did their slaves come from on the West African coast, and what was the impact? What was the social condition? How did they interact, the two groups of people? So language migrations in the Loyalist period. I'm looking at two migrations, all right? One migration is very well documented. The Loyalist arrival of 6,000 between 1783 to 1785. The second one, the arrival of some 9,540 slaves direct from Africa, is not so well documented, and it really presents, I'm sure it presents a conundrum to the historians, but I mean, it's something obviously that we would have to look at in more detail. So, as far as the first group are concerned, the 6,000, let me go to my map. This is the extent to which the Loyalist landscape, or the Loyalist migrations, would have expanded the linguistic landscape throughout the Bahamas. So we have northern predominantly dialect, but with some emerging Bahamian Creole English. Central and southern islands, very, very much very much creolized by the arrival of the Loyalists from the plains of South Carolina.